Hey everyone, Alistair here. Hope you're doing okay. The summer months are upon us, which means two things. I need to wear more hats, and this is the part of our year when costs are high and support tends to dip. We know, believe me, things are tight everywhere at the moment, and unfortunately, that includes us. For those of you who support us already, thank you so much. We hope you're enjoying the great new Cats Cast episodes and all the PseudoPod extrusions. If you don't support us, but you would like to join them, we've got tons of options for you at both Patreon and PayPal. Even a one-off at Ko-fi makes a big difference. Or, if you're in the market for some sweet new summer wardrobe, we have a new swag store, courtesy of our amazing friends over at Void Merch, and the t-shirts are unbelievably great. It all adds up, it all helps. And it all helps us bring you the best in free audio fiction every week. So, if you can help out, please do. And thanks. And do enjoy this week's episode.
Welcome to PseudoPod Towers. Get comfy. Find a cushion to hide behind. You're going to need it. PseudoPod, episode 825. Damn, that's a lot of stories. Good job, everyone. August 26th, 2022. This week's story, Flowering Evil by Margaret Sinclair. Hey, everyone. Welcome to PseudoPod, the weekly horror podcast. I'm Alistair, your host, and this week's story comes to us from Margaret Sinclair. Margaret, who was born in 1911 on the 17th of February and who passed on the 22nd of November 1995. That's an innings. Good job, was an American science fiction writer. Beginning in the late 1940s, Sinclair wrote and published, by her own count, some 130 short stories. Sinclair wrote that she first tried her hand at detective and mystery stories, and even the so-called quality stories, before finding her niche writing science fiction and fantasy for pulp magazines. I just want to put a pin in that quality fiction thing, to reassure you that much like that conversation that happens in multiple timelines in a recent TV adaptation of a beloved series of graphic novels, the "but is genre really literature" conversation is like a Highlander, and will be with us forever. Sinclair went on. Unlike most pulp writers, I have no special ambitions to make the pages of the slick magazines. I feel that the pulps at their best touch a genuine folk tradition and have a balladic quality which the slicks like. I feel like we would have got on. Sinclair's early output included the Una and Jick series of 8 stories published from 1947 to 1949, chronicling the comic misadventures of housewife of the future Una and her devoted husband, Jick. The stories were ostensibly set in an idealized future, but cast a satirical look at post-war domestic life, with its focus on acquiring labor-saving household devices and keeping up with the Joneses. Sinclair would later remark that the Una and Jick stories were not especially popular with fans, who were then as now a rather humorless bunch. The light tone of the story seemed to offend readers and make them think I was making fun of them. She was especially prolific in the 50s, producing such acclaimed and much reprinted stories as The Man Who Sold Rope to the Knolls, 1951, Brightness Falls from the Air, 1951, An Egg a Month from All Over, 1952, and the splendidly misspelt Horror House, 1956. She occasionally drew inspiration from her education in classics and her knowledge of Greek myth, as in Mrs. Hawke, 1950, a modern update of the Circe myth. Also The Bird, in 1951, about a modern man's fateful encounter with the mythical phoenix. And finally, 1953's The Goddess on the Street Corner, in which a down-on-his-luck wino meets an equally vulnerable Aphrodite. I genuinely need to see or read a lot of these, and I also need to find out whether she and Rod Serling ever spoke. I feel like that's a connection that needs to be made. 3 of her short stories were adapted for television. Mrs. Hawke was filmed as The Remarkable Mrs. Hawke for the 1961 season of Thriller, with Joe Van Fleet in the title role. The Boy Who Predicted Earthquakes, 1950, and Brenda, 1954, were filmed as segments of the 1971 season of Rod Serling's Night Gallery. There we go! Austin answered, counsellor, and Ramsey Campbell has described Sinclair's work as startlingly original and argues it has yet to be fully appreciated. Your reader for this week's really very fun story is the frankly magnificent Alethia Contes, New York Times best-selling author, princess, storm chaser, geek. Alethia narrates stories for EscapePod, PseudoPod, and Cast of Wonders, and contributes regular book reviews to NPR. Her award-winning writing has been published for multiple age groups across all genres. She is host of Princess Alethia's Fairy Tale Rants and Princess Alethia's Travelling Sideshow every year at DragonCon. Born in Vermont, Alethia currently resides on the space coast of Florida with her teddy bear, Charlie. We will link to her homepage in the show notes. Do go say hi. So, accompanied as we are throughout this month by the amazing Chelsea on audio production, get comfy, because we have a story for you, and we promise you, it's true.
Flowering Evil by Margaret Sinclair. Narrated by Alethia Contes. Captain Bjornson shook a grizzled head. "I never saw a plant I liked the looks of less," he said. "I don't know how he got it through the planetary plant quarantine. You take my advice, Amy, and watch out for it." He took another of the little Gila nut cookies from the quaint old lucite platter and bit into it appreciatively. Mrs. Dinsmore sniffed. "I don't know what you're driving at," she said coldly, "or why you're so prejudiced against my poor little rambler. You know perfectly well that Robert would never send me anything the least bit dangerous." Captain Bjornson paused with another cookie halfway to his lips and looked at her. "Wouldn't send you anything dangerous?" he exclaimed. "Why, Amy, have you forgotten how your face was swelled up for 2 weeks from that tree cutting he sent you? The doctor said it was a contact poison worse than sumac, and he tried to get you to the hospital. What about the time that cactus from the Blue Desert went to seed, and I spent 36 hours picking spines out of you? What about—" Mrs. Dinsmore gave a warning sniff. "Well, all right," Bjornson said. "I know how fond you are of Bob, and I know you don't like me to mention his mistakes. I'll grant you he means well. So what? He's flighty, scatterbrained, and brash. To use an expression that was current when I was a boy, Bob is a twerp." Mrs. Dinsmore pulled the lucite platter so far over to her own side of the table that Bjornson couldn't get another cookie from it without getting up and stretching out along the tablecloth. "I don't agree with you," she said distinctly. "Robert is a splendid fellow, so thoughtful and considerate. He takes a real interest in my soap carvings. And how many young men with an important position like his, third mate on a space freighter with a regularly scheduled run, would remember to send back plants from every port of call to an aunt on Earth? I shouldn't be surprised if I won a blue ribbon at the flower show again this year. My golden rain plant is about to bloom. Robert tells me it's a lovely thing." The captain cast a wistful look at the cookie plate. "Well, don't say I didn't warn you," he replied. "When's Bob due in port?" Mrs. Dinsmore's face relaxed. "Around the 25th, she said. He sent me a gram. Here, have another cookie. I must think up some little thing to cook for him as a surprise." The captain snaffled a handful of cookies from the plate and stood up to go. "Your ordinary cooking's good enough for me," he declared. "But if you mean those little shrimps fried in batter you had the last time he was here, go ahead. And watch for that plant." He stalked off across the lawn. "He's getting old," thought Amy Dinsmore, watching the gruff old codger limp around the flower bed. Bjornson had had prosthetic surgery after he lost his foot, and, though it had been successful, grafts were never as flexible as natural members. Positively old. He ought to see a geriatrician right away. She'd tell him so the next time he came to see her. Talking about Robert that way. She set the dial on the robot gardener on the front lawn to weeding dandelions, and started along the path that led to the little hothouse where most of the plants Robert had sent her were growing. Even in the deep tropics, Terra was, with few exceptions, too cold and dry for them. The Martian subjects, on the overhand, were in a cycroplex lean-to, with hygroscopes and a battery of infrared lamps to keep the temperature up during the day. The heavy, moist air of the hothouse made Amy Dinsmore pant a little as she entered it. But how interesting it was! Even the leaves of her Venusian plants were fascinating, thick and leather-like, thin and dry and hard like parchment, hanging in heavy serpentine coils or bristling, pointed and sharp as so many spears. And their coloring ranged from cerise, through a silky taupe and indigo, around to an angry, bright metallic blue. As for their flowers, oh my! Amy Dinsmore had never seen anything like them. All you could do was stand in front of them with your mouth open and stare. When she wasn't looking at her Martian succulents, they were her favorites of anything she grew. She halted in front of the plant Robert had sent her last. Yes, Hjalmar Bjornsson was getting definitely senile. How could anybody think that this poor little dried-up thing could be harmful? It was a mere bundle of desiccated stems, with only a tiny new leaf or two to indicate that it was alive. It looked a little better than it had yesterday, though. The colchine solution must have been good for it. Amy brushed a few dead flies from the ledge behind it into her hand and threw them into the composter. She liked to have things neat. Now, what should she cook as a surprise for Robert? He was fond of sweet things, of course, but always seemed to her that he praised her meat dishes and entrees most. He liked her cooking so much because her roast turkeys and grilled steaks had a crust on them. Electronically cooked food was quick to prepare, and it might be as good for you as they said it was. But the outside looked like the inside, and it also tasted flavorless and gray. What was the use of saving time in cooking if you ended up with food that wasn't any fun to eat? "You aren't looking well, Amy," Captain Bjornsson said 3 or 4 weeks later. He looked at her with the critical attention of an old friend. "You've got on a lot of Cosmolac, but you still look peaked. What's the matter? Worried about Bob? Ships don't get hurt in meteor swarms anymore." He looked down at his grafted foot reminiscently. "Not like it was when I was a third mate." Amy Dinsmore shook her head. She picked up one of the brightly colored hexagons. They had been playing a desultory game of marula in the airy coolness of the side stoa, and fiddled with it. "I haven't been sleeping well," she confessed at last. "I've had such unpleasant dreams. Horrid things." "What about?" Bjornsson asked. "That blasted plant? Honestly, Amy, it looks like some kind of spider to me." "No! I don't know why you can't leave my Venusian rambler alone. Robert told me it was a very valuable plant, rare even in its own habitat. It's doing so nicely, too. A spider? I wish you'd stop trying to spoil it for me." "I'm sorry," Bjornsson apologized. "Forget it. Go on, tell me about your dreams." "Well, on Tuesday, or was it Wednesday? No, it must have been Tuesday because that was the day after I flew over to Hartford. I was down by the hothouse, and I found the most unpleasant thing beside the path." She shuddered. "I've been dreaming about it ever since." "What was it?" Bjornsson urged. "Oh, I guess it must have been a rabbit once. One of the wild ones. Only it was nothing except some fur and some bones. Nothing decayed, Hjalmar, you understand. Just gone. I can't imagine what had happened to it." "Better see a mental hygienist," the captain advised after a pause. "Nightmares can be very serious." "I suppose so. I really dread going to sleep." The next morning, very early, Amy turned on the floor with unsteady fingers. What a horrid dream it had been! She could hardly believe it hadn't been real, and that she was safe and sound in her own bedroom after all. Outside, the noise that had awakened her, the jagged, unearthly caterwauling of a couple of tomcats promenading in the moonlight, came again. Ordinarily, it was a noise Amy disliked very much. The poor things always sounded as if they were in deadly agony. But now she was glad to hear it. Heavens, if it hadn't been for those cats crying and waking her up, she still might be asleep and dreaming. Dreaming about blood. She turned the ceiling selector to Summer Sky, lay back on her pillow, and tried to relax. It was her favorite of all the ceilings her bedroom had, so lovely and calm and blue. And right now she needed something lovely and calm. One thing was sure, she wasn't going to stand this much longer. She didn't believe in pampering herself, but if she had that dream once more, she was going to take Bjornson's advice and see a mental hygienist. She'd think about something pleasant. Amy tried to fix her mind on her gardening, on how well her plants were doing, but it wasn't a success. When she tried to keep her thoughts on her Venusian rambler, why did they call it a rambler? It was turning into a large, stocky, compact bush more like an outsized camellia than anything else Amy Dinsmore could think of. They kept veering back to her dream and all that. Well, then she'd think about Robert. She was a lucky woman to have a nephew like him. She'd worked out several menus, all the things he liked best. But she wished she could think of something a little different. There were so few kinds of meat when everything was said and done. Lamb and beef and musk ox and bolo and pork. And she always thought bolo was stringy and tough. Gradually, Amy's nerves began to quiet. The cats had grown quiet too, except for an occasional outburst that sounded like lightning made audible. Her thoughts drifted lazily from Robert to her soap carving, and after a while, she went to sleep. The morning was sunny and bright, and she felt almost ashamed of herself for having let a dream affect her so seriously. She had finished her matutinal inspection of the hothouse and the succulent growing shed, and had started back to the house when she came on a bundle lying by the hothouse wall. At first she didn't recognize it for what it was, and stooped over it, poking it with a stick. After an instant, she straightened, nauseated, remembering where she had last seen that ginger-colored fur. The bundle was not the very bulky remains, bones and some patches of hide, of a cat. Hadn't there been some pieces of white fur, too? Of 2 cats. She'd better call Hjalmar. It might be dangerous. There must be some wild animal living near her hothouse, a lynx or ferret or wildcat or stoat. Mrs. Dinsmore wasn't strong on zoology, but she knew exactly what sort of animal she had in mind. Something lithe and dark and bloodthirsty. Goodness, it was quite frightening. On the other hand, Robert would be in port in a couple of days. If she asked Hjalmar to help her, he'd either make an enormous masculine fuss over it. She still remembered the time she'd asked him to put up a towel rack for her, and he'd arrived with a set of pocket wrenches, a hand-electric drill, 4 pairs of pliers, and a portable arc welding outfit. Or he'd pooh-pooh and pish-tush her into silence. Either way, it wouldn't be satisfactory. She'd wait for Robert. Robert was so comforting. If only she didn't have more of those dreams. Despite her apprehensions, her next night's slumber was profound and sweet. She hadn't felt so rested and refreshed in weeks. She'd put the Somni spray, maybe if she'd thought to use it before, she wouldn't have had those horrid nightmares, back into the closet, and decided she'd do some soap carving after breakfast. She felt in the mood for it, and Robert would be disappointed if she didn't have something new to show him that she'd carved since he'd last been in port. Besides, she might be able to think of the special dish she wanted to make for him while she was working. She'd found from experience that some of her best culinary ideas came to her while she was making a statuette or plaque out of soap. The meal concluded, she got out her set of modeling knives and a couple of cakes of soap. Soap was rather hard to get, since most people use synthetic detergents nowadays. But she knew a little store in Perth Amboy that carried it. This last batch had a lovely texture. Amy rotated the living room on its axis until the light was exactly right, and then sat down in front of her carving desk. What should she make? A statuette? A plaque? A plaque in low relief? A plaque of a flower? Somehow, she didn't want to think about animals right now. She had sketched in the conventionalized Hermodactylus and was beginning to pick it out carefully from the background when it occurred to her that she hadn't been down to the hothouse this morning to see her plants. Why, that would never do. She mustn't neglect them. It was terribly important. Important. Her head hurt. How dizzy she felt. She'd better go at once. She'd better go. Cake of soap in one hand, knife in the other, panting a little, Amy set out toward her plants in a stumbling run. She was halfway to the hothouse before it occurred to her to question the impulse which had taken her incontinently from her carving and set her in blind motion toward the hothouse. And by then it was too late. She was no longer a free agent in any sense of the term. The mental grip which had taken the rabbit and the cats to their death had tightened on her inescapably. Remote from her body, in a glassy paralysis of fear and impotence, Amy watched her feet moving briskly down the path. Oh, if she could only cry out, "Call Hjalmar!" She felt the muscles of her throat straining, but no sound came, and now she was standing before the hothouse, and her hand had opened the door. The Rambler was waiting for her. Very slowly, like a man flexing his arm, it reached out one of the stocky branches toward her. Amy saw that at the end of the branch, well hidden under the dark green, glossy leaves, was a slender, translucent, hollow thorn. It was about the size of the hypodermic needle the doctor had used when, in her last year's physical examination, he'd taken a sample of blood. Amy knew exactly what was going to happen. First, the hollow thorn, until her veins were dry, and then the slowly opening maw, gaping above the big, swollen, meteor-wide base the thick leaves of the Rambler had served to conceal. It would take a long time, but Hjalmar would never miss her before it was too late. The Rambler's branch moved delicately over the surface of Amy's right wrist, the one with the modeling knife. The other branches were drooping limply away from the purple pink of its swollen base, waiting, while it hunted the exact spot. It hesitated for an instant, and then Amy's mouth drew into a soundless oh of pain, struck home. A dark fluid began to stain the hollow thorn. For just a fraction of a second, the Rambler's mental grip on Amy Dinsmore relaxed. She could feel its blind concentration on its own black enjoyment. And in that fraction of a second, Amy threw the cake of soap in her left hand straight into the Rambler's fleshy maw. The Rambler gripped at her mind again, but it was a disturbed and feeble grip. Its branches began to move around the fleshy bowl they had shielded, slowly, and then in a furious heaving, the thorn, which had entered her wrist, was jaggedly withdrawn. Amy, her wrist streaming blood, stared at the Rambler for a moment, and then lunged at it with the menacing knife. Sitting on the ground beside the hothouse afterwards, her forehead on her hands, feeling sick and faint, Amy had an idea. At first she pushed it from her. It was far-fetched, silly, even a little repulsive. But was it so silly after all? And as to being unpleasant, well, bolo meat commanded enormous prices in the market. And from everything she'd heard, the bolo was the very reverse of a fastidious feeder. Even pigs certainly weren't dainty in their eating habits. If she parboiled it in several waters and then braised it slowly with a hint of ginger in the sauce, well, after all, why not? Amy, the modeling knife in her hand, went into the hothouse again. "Gee, Aunt Amy, this meat's good," Robert said. He was talking with his mouth full. "I've eaten indigenous chow on 3 planets, 4 if you call the stuff they serve you on Uranus food, and it's my opinion that there isn't a better cook anywhere in the system than you. Fact. How do you do it anyway?" Amy Dinsmore lowered her eyes. She could feel herself blushing through her cosmolac. "Oh, thank you, Robert." "She sure is, Bob," Hjalmar Bjornsson said expansively. "That gravy. She's the best cook on Terra all the time, but when you're in port, she gets sort of inspired. What kind of meat is this, though, Amy? And could I have some more?" "Of course," Amy said. She refilled Hjalmar's plate. "It's something new I found in that big auto market in the city," she said vaguely. "By the way, Aunt Amy," Bob said, laying down his fork, "after I sent you that small plant, I heard it was supposed to be carnivorous. I forgot to mention it in my last gram. You didn't get into any trouble with it, did you?" "No, it died. Amy said smoothly. I had to throw it out. Too bad. She brightened. Pass your plate, Robert dear, she said.
Sinclair's work has a smile that doesn't reach the eyes and a jaunty tune behind it that's always a quarter second from turning sideways. There's so much here, in such a small space. The cheerful Jetsonian domesticity of space travel is both weirdly reassuring and weirdly ageless. This could just as easily be a high-end corporate station in the Expanse, or a Star Trek Universe freighter crew member popping home for a quick home meal. The plant. Now, the plant is where we think the horror is, and it's certainly insidious and upsetting. I love the reveal on the base and on its maw. I love the strong Audrey 2 from Little Shop of Horrors energy that image has, and you'll note, those of you who use the website, that's a tag that we have this week. I love most of all the fact that the core of the story doesn't hit you until it's done. She thinks nothing of the rabbit and the cats being killed by something inside or adjacent to her home, because the predator is already inside her mind. Also, any story where soap carving saves the day has to make the best lists. The fact it's there also speaks to the real horror of the piece and the rage that is elegantly written in beautiful cursive script between the lines that we actually get in print. Because you see, either by malice or accident, Bob almost gets Amy killed, and Amy doesn't read like she's going to forget that anytime soon. The image of her, knife in hand, covered in sap and blood, is arresting all by itself. When you add her feeding Bob his present and the possible implications of that, well, you can practically feel the rictus grin tighten, can't you? This is a woman who's been wronged. This is a woman who is done. And this may well be a woman who is just getting started. Maybe don't ask for seconds, Bob. Fantastic work, all. Thank you. Hey, did you know we have 5 shows? EscapePod does science fiction, PseudoPod does this, Podcastle does fantasy, Cast of Wonders does YA, and Catscast does cats, and very occasionally dogs. I am at the top of my 16th year in this chair, and it is frankly ridiculous to still be here, and I love it. Absolutely love it, and a big part of that is how honoured and humbled I am to work with such an amazing team, such amazing authors, and you, because make no mistake, as an audience member, you're part of that team too. We rely on you. We rely on you to pay our authors and cover our server costs, and frankly every other cost. We're now at the point where we're paying everyone, and that's a major benchmark because we believe everyone who works in this field should be rewarded for their time. It's needed too. Without any element of our staff, from editors to authors, hosts to producers, slush readers to associate editors, the whole system collapses. Everyone is needed. Everyone deserves to be paid. And that is where you come in. If you can help out financially, please do. I know times are tough. I know it looks like they will be getting tougher for a while. But if you can donate any amount you want, or subs starting from $5 a month through PayPal and Patreon. That gets you access to the support bonus content, including PseudoPod Extrusions, which is a whole other season of the show, and extra episodes of Catscast. It's a great deal. You get things, we get resources to make more things you then get. Everyone wins. We also understand completely if you don't have the money to spare, but perhaps you have some time. You could link to an episode you really liked, or perhaps if you have a show or a blog or a magazine that you would like to interview us on. We love that kind of stuff. Do please get in touch. I'm sure we'll work something out. But regardless, we do need help. We need you. And if you can, please give us a hand. Join us next week on September 2nd for episode 826, Dream House by C.O. Davidson. I'll be your host once again, and the reader will be the incredible Amy H. Sturgis, and Marty will be in the audio production seat. So, thank you so much for listening, and remember, then, as now, we will be a production of Escape Artists Incorporated and released under a Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives license. We're going to leave you with these words from Day of the Triffids by John Wyndham. And we danced on the brink of an unknown future to an echo from a vanished past. We'll see you next time, folks. Have fun.
It's a PseudoPod. It's a big foot.
It's all about podcasts these days.